Nintendo opens its first offices in New York. Commodore introduces the Vic-20, and Adventure gets reviewed. These stories and many more on this month's episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine.
I've been waiting a long time for a chance to say this. Stop the presses.
Requiescat in pace.
Makes him crazy, man. What is a man?
It's me, Mario.
What a mess.
Get over here!
Please save me.
Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Video Game Newsroom Time Machine, the show where we travel back in time to see what was making headlines in the video game industry decades ago. Today's episode will be jumping back to both January 1981 and January 1971. But before we do that, my name is Carl, and my co-host Peter is here as always. Say hi, Peter.
Hi.
Excellent. So, let's do the obligatory banter before we get started. Peter, has anything happened at all since last we recorded? Considering that we're recording on the 23rd of January of 2021, yeah, if you're listening to this later, just look up the history books. It's been an eventful month since we recorded.
Oh, yeah.
So, but, yeah, did you at least do anything entertaining in the meantime?
You know what the sad thing is? I really have to try to remember what I did besides working, you know? I don't know, but this is what many people tell me, especially last year, and it's of course due to this COVID-19 shit. Beep. But it's like work, sleep, work, sleep, work, sleep, 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 which is weekend. Work, sleep, and you know, time just goes by so fast, and you don't know what happened. You really can't remember what happened other than you working, and I start to notice that this isn't driving people nuts, you know?
Oh, it definitely is. Yes, and you work in the healthcare business, so that's, yeah. There's nothing else to say there. We're turning into COVIDiots at this point, not in this term of the freaking QAnon idiots who think that it's just a hoax, but basically it's numbing our minds from the stress. So let's do something entertaining and move straight into our first jump, where we're going to go back 50 years to the year 1971. And unfortunately, we don't have a sound cue for that one, but we do have brand new sound cues for the new year. We're going to get to those in a moment. So just imagine really cool 1971 music. I guess some leftover Summer of Love stuff or something. Okay.
A preliminary agreement was signed for Magnavox Odyssey.
Sanders and Associates signed a preliminary deal with Magnavox to license their TV game technology. The tech would evolve into the Magnavox Odyssey, the first game console and inspiration for Atari's Pong. So we're going to be talking more about the Magnavox Odyssey in the years to come, obviously. But this, again, it's not a computer-controlled device. It's hard-coded electronics, if you will. And we only know about this initial signing not because of anything in the trades, but because it's cataloged in Ralph Baer's book, Video Games in the Beginning, where he goes into great detail. So I'm going to be referring back to that in the next couple of years as this story develops, because it is the primary source for the dates. But yeah, the Magnavox Odyssey will become the first game console, if you will, the first device that people will play ball and paddle games on their TVs with. And it is also going to be what is going to spark a lot of fun legal actions in the courts over the years to come.
Fun for your kid, fun for your lawyer. However,
And what happens
can you
if the
remind?
lawyer is the kid?
Exactly. Yeah, I remember. But can you remind me what was the release date of the Magnavox Odyssey?
Oh, now you're asking questions, which of course I have the answer to because I am just that good. And I'm not relying at all on Wikipedia. And if you hear any strokes of the keyboard in the background, that has nothing
It's a kid walking by, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
With a cup of coffee saying, "Hi, Dad."
Released in 1972, September.
Oh, okay.
So we still have a little ways to go before the technology turns into an actual playable commercial device. But that makes sense. I mean, this is brand new technology. Nobody's ever done this before with a television set.
No.
And so it's going to be a while before they've designed the box, they've designed the circuitry, figured out which games to include, figured out how to market it, and also reduce the cost of the device enough that it makes sense.
Yeah. Well, this is where I was asking, and I think 1.5 years is a pretty short time for that.
Well, I mean, at this point, the basic technology already exists. So the idea of how to implement it has already been finalized. It's now just a question, how do you turn it into a mass consumer product?
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah. Okay. So that's going to conclude our 50-year jump. Before we jump, let's check in with Ethan for the Department of Corrections.
So, Ethan, lay it on me. What did we mess up this time?
You may think you have escaped 2020, but I'm going to come and throw it right back at you. Going back to 1980, we're going to do some corrections. But before we start the corrections, there's a new segment on here I'm going to call the Peter Comment. Peter Comment. Peter Comment. There's a comment for Peter, and make sure he hears this. In this section, when you were doing your obligatory banter, as always, he had a good pun of video killed the radio star in reference to video games. So, good job, Peter.
I will pass that along.
Good. And before getting into the full corrections, there's one self-correction I have to make from the December episode. It is in regards to Space Invaders. When we were talking about it, you talked about the figures you saw on Wikipedia. Those figures are wrong, and they were wrong, but I forgot that the document that we have does actually have numbers for it.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I said that it does not actually have numbers, and it wasn't even in the top 10. I was wrong about that. I just kind of assumed it was further down the list. It is number 2, next to Pac-Man. And by 1983, it had sold 6 million units, approximately. There's
on the 2600, just to be clear. We're talking the 2600.
Solely on the Atari VCS 2600. It had sold a little over 6 million by the end of 1983, and then it would sell residual units after that. But it's probably fair to say it sold between 6 and 7 million copies on the 2600 VCS.
That's not too shabby.
Yeah, I mean, second most successful game ever to that point. And, would still be a hit today, though they would never have that long of a tail on games like this today. It did, because I think it sold like 3 million in 1980, but then it would sell its other half in the next 3 years.
Gotcha. Well, nowadays they keep selling it. They just discount it to like $250 on Steam or something.
Yeah, so it was a huge money earner for them. So that's my correction on myself, but I'm going to make it up for it with many corrections for you, Carl.
Oh, you hurt me so. Okay, hit me with the first one.
All right. You discussed with this with me already, but let's put it out in the air. Gene Lepkin would technically not been one of the first stockholders in Atari because they would have been giving out stock way before he even got there to other executives.
Okay, and I got that. There's a link to the source for that in the show notes. It was an interview, I believe, with him, or an article about him that was published a couple years after he left, talking about him being one of the original stockholders. Now, they may have been talking about him being one of the original stockholders at the time of the IPO, but that doesn't make any sense because there were a ton of stockholders at that point.
Well, not IPO, but when Warner purchased them, I imagine that he was one of the major stockholders. That's probably what they mean.
Okay. That's probably. Okay. And yeah, okay, I can see that. I can understand that. Like I said, I was going off of an article on that one, so mea culpa. Now, who would you have counted as one of the first stockholders?
Well, obviously, the first ones would be Nolan, Ted, Al Alcorn, their wives. I forget if Steve Bristow held some at some point. Definitely Joe Keenan did. Then there were a couple executives that came in before then that probably would have been holding stock in Atari before Lipkin arrived. Lipkin arrives in 74, mid-74.
Okay. Now, would it already have what was the legal structure of the company up until that point?
Private company, but it did have stock. We actually do. That's documentation we have. We have information on who would have been holding stock in this and that. So the stock is only worth as much as what it means when you finally sell to something. But they did have stock.
Gotcha. Okay.
And then when Warner bought them, they bought all the stock, 100%. So it's not like they got a share of Warner stock for their Atari stock.
Oh, really? They just basically got a cash buyout.
As far as I remember, that was the agreement. That it was $28 million. I know that's the figure, and I don't believe it was in stock exchange. It was just cash.
Wow. Okay. That is pretty hefty.
Yeah, and then they go on to become a very fast-growing company. Which, speaking of, the next correction in this is more of an argument, but we've had a couple of those before.
Yes.
It's the idea that in the episode you talk about Atari's mismanagement, of which there was mismanagement, but your quote was, "If someone knew what was going on, they could have steered Atari clear of their problems." But this is unprecedented field. Consumer electronics has only just barely existed for a little bit. And while there's lessons that could have been learned from that, it is not a case where the technology was really the problem. What Nolan Bushnell said before he left is, can the VCS, get rid of it. And at the end of 1978, get rid of it. At that point, Space Invaders hadn't even been released on it yet. It had more of a life to it. They were not wrong to keep focusing on that product. So that's why I kind of want to say that it's not really fair to say that they just didn't know what was going on, because nobody did.
Well, and here would be my counterpoint to that. Because we're not talking about just one major dip in the market or crash. We're talking about two of them. The first one, obviously, was the arcade downturn that essentially happens a year beforehand. Now,
I call it a crash, but don't tell Alex.
Okay. I won't tell Alex, I promise. Now, Lipkin is a second-generation coin man. So he actually came from the operator side of it. And
well, he was at a manufacturer too. Before that, he was at Allied Leisure.
That too. but he came from the operator side, which gave him a certain amount of understanding and probably also credence with the operators. He would have listened more to what the operators were telling him as far as what coin drop was like at the time. And I think that had he still been, this is of course, a Monday morning quarterbacking and everything, but I think that if he had still been at Atari at the time of the arcade crash or downturn, he probably would have seen the signs coming much earlier than the so-called Atari suits or Warner suits could have foreseen, because they weren't going to be listening to the operators. They weren't going to be looking at those subtle hints that had come and gone with so many other coin-operated amusements in the past, such as pinball and the periodic ups and downs of jukeboxes and so forth. So I think that there was nobody in Atari after Lipkin in the coin-op division that would have had that connection or that understanding of that market.
Well, in general, the coin-op division wasn't the problem. It wasn't really losing that much money. I mean, in the 1983 period when everything's falling apart, Atari basically becomes number one. They have a couple good hits like Star Wars and things like that. So that wasn't like, there probably should have been some changes that would have helped the company as a whole. I don't think that was really the problem, and more the quote that you were saying is that nobody was really focusing on where the technology was going, that you needed to go forward in the technological realm, which has been the narrative that's been focused around the Atari corporate culture for a long time.
Well, yes and no. And hear me out on this one. This is sort of a working theory, if you will. If you had seen the arcade crash that comes the year before, which is largely propelled by too many Me Too products, an oversaturation of new vendors on the market throwing games out there. Basically, it's everything that's going to hit a year or so later in the console market is hitting in a very different scale in the arcade market. Had they had somebody who said, hey guys, we got to turn back, there's too much product out there, we need to refocus, only bring out the top tier product, pare it down a little bit, maybe organize, I think that you would have been able to at least have had a feeling inside of the company, hey wait, if this can happen in arcade and everything that is big in arcade is big the next year in the console, these two markets are in many ways synergistic. There at least was the chance of saying, hey, wait a sec, maybe we need to reevaluate this. And instead, I think the only management that you had left were the people who were looking at the overall Warner results and ignoring anything that could have been learned from the long-standing coin-op amusement industry.
The market forces are so different. I've suggested to you that when the crash happens, we should get around and talk more specifically about this stuff. So don't want to spend too much time on this on this particular correction, but that's my thoughts on that. So moving on.
Moving on. But yeah. Okay.
So the next one in the line is you were trying to figure out that weird red handheld that looks like a telephone. It's Merlin. Yeah. Merlin.
Yes. I thought about it. I came up with the name after the fact fairly quickly.
And you even said you would on the podcast.
Yeah, and I just couldn't remember.
Yeah. Merlin by some strange doctor guy who I need to interview sometime, but that's for the future. And then you after that you were talking handhelds, and you're talking about there's a new Game Boy thing or a new Game & Watch thing that came out recently, and how it portrays the original intention of Yokoi, even though Yokoi wasn't, he didn't really come up with the form factor in a sense of Game & Watch. He came up with an idea to do something in that space. Yeah. But, you know, the Game & Watch itself evolved over time. There are a lot of different ways that it worked, and there are some that you couldn't even really fit in your pocket. I'm not talking about the fold together ones, which kind of fit in that mold, but there were others, you know, that had the joystick, which they used the D-pad to replace, and things like that. And so it was never, like, even when they were working on it, it wasn't an inconspicuous device. It definitely became something that was that was not the original intention of basically looking like a calculator or watch device.
Gotcha. This is true. And I don't even remember what the context of that was. No, it wasn't it that it was originally supposed to sort of double as a clock in case the boss came by, and that as the shape changed, like it became the flip. It's no longer the issue.
I think that's kind of reading into it, because I mean, the only source on this I have, which is the History of Nintendo Volume 2 by Florian Gorge, really the only intent that they specifically talk about is making something that salarymen wouldn't feel ashamed to carry around in their pockets.
Okay, that makes more sense. A lot more sense, actually, all things considered. Okay.
So, that's the end of the... Nope, that's the end of the corner. Before we get to the show, though, I would like to say that this episode will, and the subsequent one for the rest of the year, will feature new sound effects, which I engineered, and the music is by Enzo Maida, who is a Brazilian composer, who also does some other game history stuff. And he composed the tracks for me, and I hope everybody enjoys them.
And we thank him very much. Really kick-ass sound effects. And with no further ado, let's say goodbye to Ethan and say hello to January 1981.
Bye-bye.
Rapidly becoming an international craze. Computer revolution. 1981.
This is only the first step in newspapers by computer.
Right in the midst of it, thank you.
Welcome to January of 1981. Peter, what's our first story?
Bowser rejoice. Nintendo of America opens its first offices.
You do know Bowser doesn't exist yet at this point, right? Just saying.
I was thinking of Doug.
Doug?
Doug Bowser.
Doug Bowser?
You don't know who Doug Bowser is?
Who's Doug Bowser?
Jeez, really? He's the president of Nintendo of America right now. I kid you not.
The current. Oh,
yeah.
Sorry. I was just way, way too deep into the whole time travel thing. I'm like, he wasn't the president of Nintendo of America in 1981. Okay, you're breaking the fourth wall here.
Yeah, but this is why our podcast works. You know, I bring in the actual the recent knowledge. You know, and you're like stuck in the past. Wonderful. Anyhow.
And I was thinking of the Bowser character from Mario Brothers. Okay. So, yes. New York City is the home of the first Nintendo of America office. In addition to the administrative offices for the US and Canada, a showroom for Nintendo's arcade games is also on site. They have also announced that Ron Judy and Alan Stone, the owners of Far East Video, the company that had been distributing Nintendo product from Seattle, have now joined Nintendo as marketing managers. So this is the true founding of on-site Nintendo of America. So they're going to New York. They're going to try to establish themselves in the most important city, and we're going to see how that works out with their cool, new, hot game radar scope.
Hey, since you're stuck in the past, how was it received that Nintendo of America opens its first office?
Well, the trade magazines, have big articles about it. It's another player coming in. And as we talked about the last few months, more and more of the Japanese arcade manufacturers are starting to set up operations in North America. They're starting to set up their own offices so they can distribute their product themselves, as opposed to having to license it out to American manufacturers. And we see this also in the fact that the American manufacturers are beginning to rely less and less on imported Japanese product, because they're also starting to put more resources into developing their own. This is how we saw all those new games at the AMOA. And there's more new US-made video games on the horizon. So while it started in the States with Atari, after Space Invaders, there's a lot of production in Japan, and now a lot of the American companies, especially the pinball makers, are starting to get into video. So what we're seeing now is that people are going to be relying less and less over the coming years. There's still going to be some importing, companies like Romstar and stuff, into the 90s. But for the most part, you make it, you distribute it. And so this is seen as, okay, there's more players. We're going to be getting the product more directly. And these are just more people getting us hopefully great games that will generate more coin drop.
Okay. So it was not perceived as an invasion from the Far East. I mean, America and Japan, they had a difficult history too.
Those kind of comparisons are happening at this time in the microcomputer market. I mean, all the magazines this month had some form of editorial or piece about the Japanese invasion of new machines. We're not going to talk about it, but there was, for example, a review of NEC's first PC, the PC 8000 series, and so forth. That is a fear on the side of the home computer market. They're fearing the same thing that happened to calculators and to digital watches. Basically, a ton of cheap Japanese imports just wiping out the market, or at least dropping the prices of the market so low that the American manufacturers couldn't stay in the market. And so that fear is on the horizon, but we're about to see how the Americans are going to respond to that one. And but as far as the video games and the arcades are concerned, from the American operator standpoint, this is perfectly okay. They don't care where the games come from as long as the games are good and produce a lot of coin drop. The American manufacturers do see this as a bit of a than a bit of a threat, because they've seen their pinball sales drop. But the real thing for them is that if these people come over, they're not going to be able to license the really good games. They may still be able to license the second-tier games or the third-tier games. And this is why they have to up their game. But we're not talking about a mass consumer product. We're not talking about something that is produced in such large quantities that the economies of scale will push the prices down. And that's, I think, the big difference between the arcades and the home devices, where, yeah, they might be able to produce it a little bit cheaper, but since you're only talking about tens of thousands of units and not millions of units sold, this changes the dynamic, and it's not as price sensitive of a market. So the arcade operators are not going to buy something just because it's $10 cheaper. They need to make sure I have the hottest game that all the gamers want to put a coin in. If it's a cheaper game, The players don't know how much I paid for the game. They don't care how much I paid. They're going to be paying their 25 cents no matter what. And therefore, I need to have the hottest game no matter what it costs me.
Okay. Gotcha.
Yeah. So different dynamics for these two different markets.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
Want to move on?
Yes, let's do it.
Yes. Atari debuts Warlords and Red Baron.
These two new games, announced at shows in the UK and Germany, while not the best known of Atari's classics, are considered classics for very different reasons. Warlords, the 4-player battle game, is a fan favorite to this day, while Red Baron would be the game that legendarily brings together the mega duo of Wild Bill Staley and Sid Meier, the founders of Microprose.
Oh, yeah.
For the Red Baron story, of course, it's been repeated everywhere a billion times, and rightfully so, because it's an amazingly cool story. And also, Wild Bill told us that story when we interviewed him, and there's a link to that interview in the show notes. Now, have you ever seen a video or tried playing either Warlords or Red Baron?
Warlords, not that I know of. Red Baron, isn't there a Sierra adaptation of that game?
Yeah, I mean, there's been a lot of games called Red Baron over the years, but this is not really related to it other than the setting is both World War I and they're both flight sims.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I know, yeah. The Sierra Dynamics game is a completely different beast. This is a fairly simplistic, few lines on the screen representing everything, and you fly around and have to shoot the other planes. It's very, very simple first-person shooter flight game, but it is the one that legendarily starts sort of it's the first initiation of Wild Bill and Sid Meier talking in depth about games at a conference in Vegas, and where Sid Meier outperforms Wild Bill, the actual pilot, and Sid says, I could make a better game, and Bill says, well, if you could make it, I could sell it, and that's how Hellcat Ace starts, and before you know it, they're in business making games. So, and Warlords is this, I don't want to call it a Pong variant, but it's this 4-player game where each corner of the screen has a little castle, and you're defending the walls of the castle from the other players. It's a wonderfully addictive game if you have 4 players. It's just one of those games that is just unbelievable amounts of fun with 4 players around the screen. So, okay. Moving away from the arcades and going to the home computer market.
Yeah, Commodore introduces the Vic-20.
Commodore's push to create a low-cost, mass-market computer is taking new form. Creative Computing reports from Commodore's September press conference at the Four Seasons in New York, where the company showed off the final form and specs of the Vic-20. The model they showed off was the Vic-1001, the version of the system that was launched in Japan, not only adapted for that market, but also launched before the U.S. Jack Tramiel, I gotta remember to do that right. Jack Tramiel is not about to let the Japanese steal this market the way they did with calculators and digital watches. At $299, the machine with a full keyboard is a fraction of the price of the competition. When it launches through Commodore's existing retailers in January, we will see if the market is ready for this new price point. So,
I'm an economist. So, is $299 actually covering the costs?
$299 is covering the costs. Now, to put this into a little bit of perspective, I looked through some of the ads for other machines that were selling at the time. I saw some ads for the Atari 800, which is the version of the Atari 8-bit computers that had a full keyboard. And those were retailing for about $800 some at the time.
Exactly.
So $299 is a massive reduction. Now, in fairness here, and we're going to talk about this in a moment again, the VIC-20, it's named after the video interface chip. What Commodore has done here, and this is their big innovation, they've put all the video hardware into one chip. They've put all the sound hardware into one chip. They've reduced the CPU to one chip. The production of microchips at this time is still very, very expensive. The more chips you need, the more expensive your device is. By bringing these chips or all of this down into single chips, and this is where Commodore's ownership of MOS technology becomes so key. They have an unbelievable ability to turn around and design their own chips at relatively low costs. That other manufacturers of computers at the time, they don't have these facilities. They still have to contract out the manufacturing of chips, which limits the quantity of new designs that they can actually affordably develop. Now, that being said, this is a very limited machine. It's only got 5K of available memory. Okay. The Atari 800 that I just mentioned, I believe, is selling with 42K or 48K at this point, 48K probably. So it's obviously a much more limited system. Now, they're going to compensate for this with things like memory add-ons, where you can expand it up to 32K. It has a cartridge slot, just like the Atari machines do. So if you're loading software from cartridge, you don't really need that much memory because you can constantly be swapping back and forth between the cartridge and won't really notice the time delay. If you have to load it off of a cassette, every time you need more than the 5K, you're going to have to load again. But if you're pulling it off a cartridge, you can just constantly be swapping out. So the 5K limitation, as long as your software is on cartridge, which a lot of people thought it was going to be. Remember the TI-99 that we talked about that launched the year before? That was really supposed to be a cartridge software-based system and so forth. These are elements that are cost reductions that make sense for the time. There's also, for example, unlike the Atari system that has 4 joystick ports, this thing only has 1.
Okay.
So they're cutting costs in all the right places, you might say, to make it still a functional computer, but a computer where at the end of the day, if you really want to use it, I mean, if you want to store any of your work, you're going to have to buy either a tape, the tape deck for it, or the hard drive, the floppy drive for it. And so by the time you get to the floppy drive is as expensive as the computer itself. So suddenly this $299 computer jumps up to a $600 purchase. And the way Commodore, I think, is calculating it at this time is they're not looking at the Commodore VIC-20 as a $300 computer. They're really looking at people walking out of the store after having spent about $800. But for that $800, you now have a machine that can do a lot of stuff. And with the other machines, you're spending $800-900 or more, and you still have to buy the disk drive. You still have to buy all that other stuff in addition. Now, those other machines may be more capable in some regards, but the VIC chip, the video chip, and the sound chip that's in this thing are in many ways leagues ahead of, for example, the Apple II at this point.
Okay.
Now, they're not ahead of another computer we're about to talk about, but they are leagues ahead of the Apple. They're leagues ahead, of course, of the aging Commodore PET line and the TRS-80 line. And they are fairly competitive, I would say, with the TRS Coco, the color computer. Now, the color computer has a few other bells and whistles that make it a little bit better, but it also has the corresponding price tag. So, and the Commodore machine with an adapter can be plugged into a television set, which is a huge, huge deal because it's going to be a cost savings. Remember, color monitors at this time are almost worth their weight in gold, and they're heavy. So, very, very expensive proposition. So, but yeah, the VIC-20 is going to go on to become the first computer that sells over 1 million units. So it's coming into the market 4 years after the Trinity, and it's going to be the first one to hit 1 million units sold. That's how small this market is at this point. No computer has sold 1 million units. Not even the TRS-80, which is by far the most sold microcomputer. So now it may have been with all of the TRS-80 models together, but no single model has sold that much. The VIC-20 is going to do this very, very quickly. And it's significant that they launched it in Japan first. They're basically sending a shot across the bow of the Japanese makers. Saying, hey guys, here's ours. Boom. Flop it on the table. What do you got? And Jack is not going to stop there. And it's important that all the articles mention that it's going to be sold through Commodore's existing retailers. So these are computer retail specialists at this point. Remember, Commodore tried to buy their own retail chain with Lafayette a couple years ago, before this. And that didn't work out. They're still going through all these computer retailers. That's not going to last. And it's going to also have major repercussions, both for the development of the industry, but for Commodore itself. In many ways, it's going to be the death of Commodore, that move. But it's also going to be the reason Commodore rises. So we're going to get to that when we get to it. But for right now, this is still going to be a computer specialist retail item. It's coming in at a price that nobody's seen before, and we're going to have to see whether or not the people who buy at a computer specialist store are interested in this cheaper device, or if people will actually search it out.
Okay, but this is a topic for the months to come. In more recent news, speaking of 1981, Chris Crawford explains prides on the Atari 8-bit.
Game design luminary Chris Crawford pens an article explaining how the Atari 8-bit computers handle player character and missile graphics, as they're called at the time. The word sprites hasn't been coined yet as such. In a wonderful article in Compute magazine. The article builds on the hype surrounding Star Raiders and explains how the techniques work, why they are relatively easy to implement on an Atari, and why your Apple or Pet aren't going to be pulling these off anytime soon.
So was it like an advertisement for the Atari 8-bits and downgrading the Apple or the Pet?
No. No, right. The way to look at it is Compute magazine at this time is a computer dedicated to all the machines that run on a 6502 type processor. And the reason for that is that these magazines all started as magazines for type-in listings, primarily. And so all of these machines, because they have the same CPU, the TRS-80, for example, is not covered by the magazine, because it's using a Z80 processor. But the 6502, if you're writing, for example, in machine code language, it's basically the same code for each of these machines, unless you start trying to use the specialized graphics hardware that's in each one. That's when your code is not going to be compatible anymore. And what the Atari 8-bit line does, remember, the Atari 8-bit computer, this is another one of the brainchildren of Jay Miner, the guy who was also the principal in designing the video hardware of the Atari 2600 and would later go on to do the Amiga. he is pushing the video hardware to places it's never gone before. This is the first home computer that's got hardware sprites. Okay. And what that means is if you wanted to put a character on the screen and move them around in previous machines, you either had to do it as a character set, like a letter on the screen, and which usually meant that you were limited to the type of movement that you got from letter to letter. So basically the character would jump from one spot to the next spot.
Yeah.
Or you had to redraw the entire screen to move the one character. So you're using up a lot of processing cycles to do this.
Yeah.
If you have hardware sprites, you can have one thing on the screen and the sprite is being calculated completely separately. And I know I'm oversimplifying this. The techies might want to kill me here, but you have it moving independent of the rest of the screen. So you don't have to use an entire cycle to reprocess every pixel on the screen. You only reprocess the pixels that you're moving for the sprite. And that's the huge time saving in computational cycles, which is important in this era. So now instead of wasting cycles on how do I redraw the whole screen, now you can spend more cycles on game logic. Where should the sprite move? Why should the sprite move there? You can use the processor for that and then only move the sprite with the dedicated hardware. So this is huge. This is why Star Raiders, this game where if you look at video of it today, and we'll have a link to it in the show notes, and we've talked about Star Raiders in months past, and it also becomes the major reason why Wild Bill, his first home computer that he buys is an Atari because it plays Star Raiders. It's a first-person view or cockpit view, if you will. You're in space, and you're shooting these ships that are flying in and out. It looks horribly primitive by today's standards, but it was something that was absolutely impossible to do without the hardware sprites and any decent speed at the time. And this is the big innovation of the Atari. The Vic-20 will not have hardware sprites. It will be doing everything with character sets. Now, people on the Vic-20 will implement some fairly decent games with those character sets. But if you look at, for example, the port of Qbert that will come out for the Vic-20 in the near future, it's using the character sets, and there's like a big black box around Qbert and all the characters as they're jumping around the platforms because they're characters. They're not sprites. And it plays decently enough. And in modern day, where we are in 2020, you can get a whole bunch of homebrew games where people have figured out ways to make the Vic do sprite-like actions, but it doesn't have built-in hardware sprites. You have to do it somehow through software, which is eating into your cycles. And so this explanation Chris Crawford is giving, and Chris Crawford we mentioned before, he's the founder of the Game Developers Conference. And yeah, basically his whole game guru thing, we'll talk later at some later point about his dragon speech. He is reading this article, I highly recommend. If anybody's interested, there's a link to it in the show notes. It's kind of fascinating how he has to try to explain to the reader what is happening here. That you can now move something around the screen completely independently because there's independent hardware for it, and it's only a few lines of code to do it, whereas the code to do this before was massive. Yeah. And it's just fascinating. And how you can warp you can draw the sprite in one size, but then you can also change how big it is vertically and how big it is horizontally and stuff. And just the fact that this option exists that we, of course, nowadays would take for granted, it's kind of cool to read it, especially if you know his voice. I read the whole article with his voice in the back of my head. It's kind of awesome because he's so excited about this. So, yeah, the Atari 8-bits have hardware sprites. The secret's out. And we're about to get a whole mess of really cool games thanks to it.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
I just started, one short and simple question in like half an hour of an answer. Wonderful. This is why I love our podcast. Okay, moving on. A Calabeth reviewed, and I practiced that while you were talking.
Excellent. Very well done. As far as I can tell, that is the correct pronunciation. We'd have to ask Lord British to be sure, but okay.
Yes.
Lord British's first commercial title, A Calabeth, gets a review in Soft Talk. The reviewer warns not to be deceived by the initial impressions of a simple game, as there is much more depth to be found while vanquishing the monsters that lurk in the dungeons. The author's dry humor and good-natured wit are also complimented, as this is clearly a work that shows much of the promise of later titles that would be fulfilled.
Wait, I don't get it. So did A Calabeth fulfill the promises, or did later titles after A Calabeth fulfill
Yeah, I
the
know.
promises?
I screwed up reading the line. Later titles would fulfill the true promise of A Calabeth. So
it wasn't good.
No, it was good for the time.
Okay.
It's just very, very early on. This is Ultima Zero. Lord British is Richard Garriott. At the time, Soft Talk doesn't even have his name. They just know it was written by Lord British, and Lord British is a character who shows up in the game.
Okay.
But the idea here, this is an RPG. It's got both an overworld as well as a first-person dungeon section, very, very basic stuff. And the game builds a world. I mean, Richard Garriott himself would admit, he's basically just a teenager messing around at this point, and adapting elements from his D&D campaigns and whatever else. So it's not what you'd call hugely sophisticated game. I mean, it's a Calabeth World of Doom. It's the title that a teenager comes up with.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah. But the interesting thing here is he writes it originally for the Apple II. He released it himself in baggies with home printed instructions originally in 1979.
Okay.
And it gets a official release, a more commercial release, 1980-81, by a publisher that he signs a deal with. But it's also now been ported to the Atari. So what we're seeing now is that these games, they're just like with SSI that we talked about last year and a few other game makers, we're starting to see a more professionalization of the game publishing. We're starting to see, the idea of manuals, albeit short sometimes, boxes and so forth, is replacing the idea of some guy just programmed to put in a baggie and hung it on a peg in a computer store. We're now getting more professional product. It's coming, and it's also getting ported to multiple systems, which is a big deal because that requires a certain amount of sophistication and at this time also a relatively large investment. I mean, the idea of Lord British going out and probably porting it himself or hiring somebody to port it, but just the purchase of a second computer, you have to make at least enough money off the sale of the games to justify the cost of the second computer.
Yeah.
And when you were in the baggy days, it was going to be a hard sell to sell enough of the software to get to that point. And now you're buying another computer to do it again. And so we're seeing that this is becoming more common. There's also, I believe, an ad this month, first ad I noticed at least for Broderbund Software. Now, we talked about their games already being reviewed in the past, but now ads are starting to pop up. So we're starting to see these first publishers / developers or just developers who are going to become recognizable names for decades to come, really popping up on the scene and generating enough revenue to turn this into a profession. Yeah. And jumping away from computers and moving over to consoles.
Yeah. Adventure was reviewed.
Legendary game journalist Bill Kunkel has reviewed Atari's Adventure in his Arcade Alley column in Video Magazine. The groundbreaking game, which builds off of the exploratory world ideas already seen in Atari's Superman, would become a milestone in gaming and truly distinguish home console titles from arcade game designs.
Okay, so can you describe to a young guy like me what Adventure was like?
Adventure was, and I'm going to very, very much simplify this. There's a great episode of the where they create Worlds podcast that goes more in depth into the creation of the game, and we'll link to that in the show notes. But Adventure is an attempt to implement the Colossal Cave Adventure text adventure from mainframe computers on an Atari 2600. I'm just oversimplifying. But it's this idea of exploring a world, a fantasy world, picking up items, using items, defeating monsters, and so forth. Now, this is the Atari. It was designed to play Pong, and maybe, if you were lucky, a tank game. So your character is a square block. Picking up items means picking up other square blocks for the most part. And then walking from screen to screen, and each screen is basically just a handful of walls that are also square blocks. You defeat 3 dragons. The dragons, seriously, they do have a bit of a shape, but everybody confuses them with ducks. It's an iconic sprite. I'll show you a picture of it, but it looks like a duck. But this game is huge because just like their Superman title that came out a little bit before this, and this is something that Bill Kunkel identifies in his review, where for the first time you were exploring a fixed world. So it wasn't a game where the world was just randomly generated or was just space in the background or whatever. When you moved from screen to screen, you could go back to the previous screens and it was the same screen that you had been at before. You could draw a map of this world if you wanted to. And you would have to find objects and move objects and stuff. And here in Adventure, you're not seeing it from the side, you're seeing it from above. So you're moving through the space, and you can move back and forth through doors, find keys, find potions. Now you're doing all of this with a 1-button joystick, no menu. You can only pick up 1 item at a time. I mean, there's all these limitations, but it's hard to really express how big this game gets, how inspirational this game gets. A ton of the developers at Atari are going to try to mimic this experience. This is going to be the driving force behind the design decisions in games like Raiders of the Lost Ark and E.T. Because they're trying to catch this lightning in a bottle, this idea of exploring this world. And obviously the hardware is really not up to the task, but it's going to be one of these. Also, it's going to be one of, if not the first Easter egg in a game. Okay. Because Atari at this time is still not letting its designers put their names on the games. Remember, we had the Activision guys leave a few months earlier, and the designer of the game, Warren Robinette, he would actually create a secret room that you had to find in the game, and when you found it, it had his name in it, written on the floor. So I believe somebody has found an Easter egg that's earlier than this, but this is really the first true Easter egg. This is the one that people talk about, the one that people find in magazines and stuff. And so he put his name in the game. And I don't believe he stayed at Atari much longer after that. Now I have to look at his history. Yeah. He founded the Learning Company in 1980. So by the time this game is hitting the news racks, he's basically already left. He's already gone off to start the Learning Company. And also he developed one of my favorite games, Rocky's Boots. It's a great educational game. Educational puzzle game. If anybody ever wants to teach their kid how to build electrical circuits, this is the way to do it. So adventure is hugely popular to this day. The reason we call games where you run around, find items, and do stuff like that adventure games is because of this game. That's why we call them adventure titles. And it, like I said, it really cannot be overstated. This game it changes the idea of you buy a console to play arcade ports to you buy a console to play console games.
Okay.
That's the deciding factor here. Yeah. And also it's interesting that Bill Kunkel is doing this in a magazine dedicated to home video, to television sets and video recorders and things like that. Because there is no dedicated there's no dedicated video game magazine yet.
Yep.
So we're going to get to that soon. And
and the adventure is what happens in your head, no matter if on the screen there's only 2 frames per second.
Well, you had more than 2 frames per second because you had sprite hardware sprites.
Yeah.
The hardware sprites were just dots was the problem. Granted, we're going to see some wonderful graphic trickery on the 2600 before that system rides off into the sunset. But yes, this really is a milestone. And you're right. It's in your head and people got into it. Oh, did they get into adventure? And Atari will release a few more games along these lines where they're pushing this as far as they can. So, okay. I guess we have one more story, not 100% on point, but an important development.
Yes. Record sales are slipping.
The music industry has seen steady drops in sales of vinyl records since sales hit a peak in 1978. 1980 sales numbers are on target to be as low as those in 1973. The culprit? Tape recorders. With an increasing mixtape culture developing, the music industry is in a fix. Prices of back catalog albums are being slashed to drive demand, and return policies for retailers have been changed, forcing stores to hold on to unsaleable merchandise. The retailers are reacting by selling blank tapes and those newfangled video games.
That's kind of cool.
Yeah, this was an article from Forbes magazine, and it really was interesting because this shift of record stores selling video games, or record stores becoming multimedia stores, if you will, and only selling the software, not necessarily selling the consoles, is a trend that is going to continue for decades to come. I mean, we're going to have these big retailers in the United States and all over the world. I mean, in the United States, places like Best Buy, Media Play, things like Sunset Records, and so forth. They would all be these multimedia outlets going forward because record sales were not enough with the massive copying that was going on at the time.
One question, because I don't quite see the connection. The price of some albums are being slashed and the return policies for retailers have been changed, is what you were saying. Which means that the studios were like, hey, retailers, keep the stuff. We don't want to have it back. Am I right?
Yeah. Basically, with the lower price, so what they're doing is they're taking older albums and reducing the price, which is something that didn't really happen before.
Okay, so and then retailers are reacting to that by selling blank tapes.
Yeah. Well, so what's happening is that the retailers are now getting stuck. So they ordered 10 of an album. They only sold 3. Now they're sitting on it, and it's not selling. So they have to sell something that will sell. So they're selling blank tapes. People apparently are buying blank tapes, so now they're starting to sell blank tapes. Now, in the past, selling a blank tape would have been suicide for a record store because you're basically selling to people the thing that's going to allow them. But at the same time, what else are they going to sell since they're now stuck with all this unsellable merchandise?
Yeah.
And they can't send it back like they could in previous years.
Can you put video games on one of those tapes?
You could put computer games on a tape, but you couldn't put a video game, a cartridge game on a tape.
No. I mean a computer game. Okay.
Yeah, if you're using a lot of the machines are still using tapes at this point. Now in North America, the tape as a medium for computer software is going to die out fairly quickly. Within a year or two, nobody's really looking at tape anymore as an option. The original Trinity in 77 was almost exclusively using tapes. They were already selling disk drives as well, and the more higher end users were using those. But for a lot of people, tape was still the way to go. And in Europe, tape will still be a big deal, especially in England and Spain. Those two territories will rely on tape well into the 90s for the 8-bit computers. Not for the 16-bit, but for the 8-bit computers. And in the States, it's going to die out by 81, basically. It's going to be the death of tape as a storage medium for 8-bit computers. And yes, it was as easy as putting the tapes, the game tape and the blank tape in a dual tape recorder and just hitting record.
Okay.
That's how fast you could duplicate games.
When did you work? Wasn't there a story including tapes? And I don't want to get deeper into that matter, but when did you work in an arcade shop, arcade place?
I didn't work. Well, I worked in an arcade in the 90s in the States, but I worked in a computer store in Argentina in 89, 90. 88 through 90. And yes, there I occasionally may have made copies of software.
Yeah.
And people would bring in their tape drives.
Okay.
No, they bring in their tape drives. The problem with the tape drives was that they were very finicky. So sometimes you would buy, if you got the tape from a different device, it may not work on your device. And they had these little screws in the front that you could turn to adjust. Well, because even small differences in the reading speed would influence the data rate. And often you weren't using the most high quality tapes. So what would end up happening is that there are little bits of static and noise pollution that when you're listening to a song on tape you didn't really mind would be enough to disrupt the data flow on a computer game. Okay. Yeah. So this is why people would bring in their data sets, the tape drives for the computer, and you would copy the games onto the tape on their data set so that they could be sure it would work when they got home.
I wasn't really thinking about it up to, basically right now, but in Argentina, tape drives were a thing. Argentina. Tape drives were a thing back in 1989.
For the Commodore 64 and the ZX Spectrum and the Amstrad CPC, for some people, yes. Now, most of the Commodore 64 users in Argentina at the time did have disk drives. But if you were on the slightly poorer side of town, then you were still using cassette.
Okay.
Yeah, just because the medium was cheaper, the drive was cheaper. I mean, literally a fraction. Because even towards the end, the disk drives cost as much as the computer, or close to it.
Mm.
And that has to do with the Commodore disk drive, which was a huge hunk of junk, super slow, et cetera, and at the same time had the downside that it had its own chips in it. It was basically a computer in and of itself. It was a terrible design. Yeah. But that just made it super expensive.
The design was terrible and it was super expensive. Okay.
Exactly. But you had the amazingness that was the Commodore 64. So, you take the good and the bad, and it's still better than being stuck with a ZX Spectrum. Okay. And I'm just saying that, nah, ZX Spectrum people. No, just kidding. I have no animosity whatsoever. Just pity. Okay, yeah, sorry. Now I'm just going into playground debates about 8-bit computers. Okay, We're going to let that be. No offense to any Speccy fans out there. I truly do appreciate the Speccy. It's a marvelous little machine. So, okay. Believe that concludes our 40-year jump back to January of 1981.
Exactly.
We've made it into the new millennium, or the new year. Yeah. And well, here we are. So, any final thoughts, Peter?
That was fun.
Excellent. Have fun.
Bye-bye.